The Vincast is supported in part by Vinus, the iPhone app which recognizes any wine bottle with just the snap of a photo. Keep track of your favorite wines and see what your friends and family who are also wine lovers are keeping track of and what they think. This iPhone app that's been developed in Australia, exclusively for use in Australia and New Zealand, recognizes a label when you take a photo of it and will tell you what the wine is, and then you can rate and review it and share it with networks. That might be with the app itself, or you can hook it up with stuff like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. It's really easy to use. It also gives you an indication about what you might expect to pay for it and even where you might be able to buy a wine. It's a really fast-growing wine community, and you can follow other wine lovers and professionals like me on there. So just go to www.getvinus.com/Vincast, download the app, and start snapping away. Basically, Vinus is breaking down barriers for people to enjoy wine. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Vincast. My name is James Scaresbrook, also known as the Intrepid Wino, and thank you for tuning in, Vincasters. I hope you've been enjoying some of the recent episodes. It certainly were fun to record, and not to mention that we've had some great guests, and we've got even more guests coming up who are going to be really, really interesting. So for this week's episode, I invited a guy called Dave Brookes, who is otherwise known on social media as Vinofreakism, which is also the name of the blog that he started several years ago, to write pretty much about sustainable and natural wines from overseas, from Australia. But he is also one of the most sought after wine judges in Australia, having been awarded Dux of the Len Evans tutorial a few years ago. So we talked a bit about his background, his philosophies. He's based over in the Barossa Valley, so it's actually the second Skype interview I've had for the podcast. So it was really fascinating, and I hope you enjoy. Thanks very much for joining me today, Dave. How's the weather over in the Barossa?
It's getting warmer, mate. Thanks for having me along as well. A bit windy today, probably 32-ish, I guess. Just dreading when it's going to be, 48 like we've had the last couple of years. But anyway, we'll see how we go.
So, for those of my listeners who may not be familiar with you, I guess you're known on the social media and your blog as Vinofreakism, but you do a lot of different stuff. But tell me, what was your first interaction with wine that kind of set you on the path?
I guess sort of having my parents sort of pushed glasses of wine in front of me growing up, not from like the Italian sort of viewpoint where kids are drinking sort of wine with like wine watered down, but they'd always like give me a sniff of wine and stuff when I was growing up. But I sort of grew up in Christchurch in New Zealand, in a place called Littleton, which is the port of Canterbury, and sort of spent most of my childhood there. And then my parents moved to inland from Waipara, just up north of Christchurch, about an hour north, in a wine region there. So I finished off my teen years up there, and they started working in vineyards and bits and pieces. Wasn't really interested in wine at that stage. Was more interested in music and surfing and skiing. So wine really didn't come into the picture then.
Okay. What were you sort of the early musical influences for you?
Oh, I worked for a heap of bands in New Zealand. Some of the just touring around New Zealand. I worked for a lighting company. I was a lighting designer. Some early musical influence. I remember I had a cousin who gave me he gave me 5 cassette tapes. I reckon I would have been about 12, and it was like what was there? Station to Station by David Bowie,
Okay.
Exodus by Bob Marley,
Wow.
Led Zeppelin. There's a Led Zeppelin album in there. What were the other two? I can't bloody remember. Anyway, they were bloody good. And he said, "You got to play these tapes until I sort of unspool and fall all over the floor." And I did. And that was probably my earliest sort of musical memories were from a cousin of mine. And I'm still a reggae nut to this day, actually.
Oh, okay. And then, and so the musical kind of career got you traveling around, that kind of thing. Did you get the opportunity to sort of like, did wine come into that at all?
Well, I did sort of later on. I was more sort of Jack Daniels and beer at that stage. Um, I was working touring for quite a few bands in New Zealand and working for a lighting company in Auckland.
Okay.
A whole lot of big acts had come through as well, and I was sort of working as a rigger on those lighting tours for bands that were touring like Talking Heads and Simple Minds and a whole bunch of quite big bands that were coming through.
Wow.
U2. A mate of mine that I used to work with got picked up by U2 actually and taken off to Dublin and started working for them. And then I came over to Australia in the sort of mid 80s, I guess. Got brought over here by a band. Hoodoo Gurus came over and did a tour in New Zealand. They ended up dragging me across to back to Australia. So I ended up working for the Gurus here for about 3 years, and then went on to work for NXS and a whole bunch of other Australian bands, and ended up working for a lighting company called Light and Sound Design. They had two offices, one in LA and one in Birmingham in the UK. So I sort of flitted in between those two offices and just worked on all these really big tours.
Okay.
Yeah, did that for just under 10 years and just got sick of touring and came back to Sydney and just got a job in a bottle shop. It's funny actually because I remember arriving in Sydney with the Hoodoo Gurus, and I still have my suitcase with me off the plane, and we went straight to the Clock Hotel
Yeah.
in Surrey Hills. And in those days, it was like this dodgy speed dealing bikie pub and just full of freaks. It was like the bar scene out of Star Wars. And and I remember standing in there with my suitcase and having my first beer in Australia, and that was the first place I ended up working in a bottle shop was the Clock Hotel when I stopped touring. I got a house in Surrey Hills, like a share house, and ended up at the drive-in bottle shop there, and it was just dodgy. There was yeah, it was pretty interesting sort of space to work in. There was stealing, you walk into the drive-through, the cool room in the drive-in, and there'd be like a big stack of stolen video recorders with like a blanket over them and stuff, and it was a pretty dodgy scene in those days.
Hmm. What were
It
the
used to be.
punters drinking back then?
Oh, they were just drinking lots of cask wine, lots of spirits. Used to have Brett Whiteley come in every day and buy a couple of bottles of Johnny Walker Red because his studio was around the back.
Yeah.
Sometimes he came in and didn't have any money, so I would give it to him on tick. I'm just spewing. I didn't ask for a painting or something. But yeah, just the classic sort of brands of the day. I mean, obviously, even stuff like sort of Lindeman's, Douglas Lamb wines were pretty big there as well. We used to sell a lot of those. I remember Douglas Lamb. I was, working in the bottle shop one day, and this old bloke came in and said, "G'day, Douglas Lamb," and I said, "Oh yeah, just over on the second shelf over there." And he goes, "No, I'm Douglas Lamb." I went, "Oh shit, sorry, dude."
Oh, too funny.
Yeah, so that was my first entry into wine, basically, and it was kind of a weird thing because I'd be working in the drive-through bottle shop and then sort of closing the pub down at nights as well. So it was a pretty colourful place, like. It was run by a guy that was really high up in the Maritime Services Union at that stage, and Abe Saffron and all those dodgy sort of colourful Sydney identities were sort of involved in the pub. So it was kind of a funny scene. But yeah, I worked there for quite a few years, and then ended up applying for a job in Double Bay, and we ended up going to Quaffers, which was in turn bought out by Coles and became their flagship vintage cellar store. So I was on the management team there.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Yeah, so that's where I sort of started getting into wine into a big way. Quite an interesting lineup of people that were sort of working there as well, like sort of John Cuff, who's in charge at Wine Arc now. He was on the team there, and Jeremy Stockman, who used to be obviously very high up in vintage cellars and is now in charge of Watson's in Hong Kong. He was one of the guys. Stuart Gregor from Liquid Ideas was our van driver.
Okay.
So it was kind of a weird crew of people, but it was great fun.
And what were the early influences in terms of the wine, whether it be particular producers or where the wines are coming from, or people you were working with, or even customers?
Oh, we were sort of given a lot of autonomy in that store when it first started off, and could basically crack open whatever we want. There was a guy that worked there called Kevin Hopko, who was sort of in charge of sort of marketing and wine sales and stuff. I guess he was pretty influential on my drinking habits because he was just constantly cracking open like first growth Bordeaux's, and so they just let us like crack open sort of Krug and Dom and like an 82 Margot or something and have it on
Whoa.
tasting in the store. And you had these amazing amazing tasting. So I guess working there was where I got sort of I got the initial sort of exposure to like the great wines. And there was I remember a French guy that I used to work with. We'd go across to the Golden Sheaf over the road, and we'd buy something like a 91 René Rostang Lalande Roti and smuggle it into the Golden Sheaf and buy a steak and like drink this bottle of wine with the steak. And it's just like things like that just started getting me into wine. I just got sort of sucked in.
Mm.
So yeah, once you get sort of sucked into that vortex, it's pretty easy to just keep on. I mean, it's a subject you'll never learn, everything about wine. That's what's such a beautiful thing about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Early on, did you find some parallels between the wine and the music? Like, did you find the wine appealing because of that that your appreciation of that kind of creative medium of music?
Yeah, I think that came later on in the piece. Winemakers like to think they're fucking rock stars, don't they? So, but I guess later on, I mean, when you start sort of thinking more deeply about wine and you start thinking about what makes it tick and stuff like that, I mean, there's only a small percentage of the of the wine drinking public that do that. Obviously, those that are very engaged with wine as a subject, but when you start thinking about sort of, major scales and minor scales and, applying it to wines, like major scale is uplifting, minor scales, melancholy. There's wines certainly sort of fit those characteristics. And, Nick Mills from Ripon in New Zealand, he's always talks about wines being tonic. And he talks about tonic as being, digestive and good for you and health giving. But, tonic, is also a scale degree and a diatonic scale, and it's a tonal center and a resolution tone. So you can also think about wines having a tonic quality in that they're in sort of perfect tonal center and stuff like that, balanced. So it's quite an interesting sort of analogy to put music to wine. But then you do it too much and you can go disappear at your own backside, can't you? Talking about that sort of stuff. You're better off just drinking the stuff. That's what it's about.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of when I was younger, and still to this day, I'm a big fan of particularly film and television and stuff like that, and like interpreting and finding meaning and stuff like that, rather than I'm not necessarily a creative person naturally, but it was something that I appreciated with wine early on was to sort of look at something someone else had created and look at the different parts and what how they're put together, and then again sort of interpreting and finding meaning in it in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. In the end, wine's just a snapshot of both a growing season and obviously the inputs from the winemaker and his sort of his outlook on the philosophy of what he's doing.
Yeah.
And I guess that sort of can come down to very much in a musical sense to like improv and stuff like that. I guess with some wines you can talk about improvisation.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a certain degree of that in winemaking, but it's just a really nice analogy. And it's nice to be able to, if you understand music or if you understand film or if you understand art, it's nice to be able to draw parallels to wine as well and in that context.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just a great thing. I mean, just being a snapshot of a growing season is just a beautiful thing, I reckon, to have in a glass. Yeah, exactly. And going back to the musical sort of analogy, it can be, you listen to some of the music these days and it's all just doctored up and full of auto tune. There's a lot of wines out there that are like that as well, but then there's a lot of wines that are just in perfect harmony and pitch without having too much input into them. It's it's just interesting.
Well, in the same way that we're seeing a lot of wines these days that are kind of in embracing more traditional kind of practices, a lot of the really great authentic music that is coming out is sort of a real celebration of pioneers back in the 60s, 70s, even 80s, and obviously even older. Whereas a lot of the manufactured music is just sort of really polished, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Going back to, I guess we're not trying to, reinvent the wheel or anything, but just like paying homage to people that have come before you and sort of try to make wines, that hark back to before we learned to make wine by numbers, before everyone had a winemaking degree and was, and your pH had to be this number and your TA had to be this number and yada, yada,
Yeah.
It's an interesting concept, but when you look at sort of wine's it's like a bell curve. Yeah. It's like sort of like at the upward scale of the bell curve, you've got sort of a wine, the grapes ripening, blah, 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 going through veraison, finally getting to the ripening point up the apex of the bell curve. As soon as you cut off that sort of bunch of grapes, it goes onto a downhill slide and it goes through sort of primary fermentation, malolactic fermentation, then into like acetobacter and then into like vinegar, basically.
Yeah.
Down the bottom of that bell curve. And we tend to make wines way up the top of that bell curve. We sort of do it very reductively and we bloody smash them with sulfur and we clarify them, we fine them, we filter them, we bash them into like an inert glass receptacle and get them out to the public. And we're basically bottling perfume. But the further you get down that bell curve, the closer it gets to like a digestive and more sort of health giving and more tonic, I guess, in the way Nick was talking about it. And that's where you get those more savory elements. And I think people are starting to make wine further down that downward slope of that bell curve. You're getting all those savory elements in. And then, there's a point down that bell curve where wines are better with food as well. They're more balanced and they're more savory and they're sapid and they're just delicious to drink. So, and generally lower in bloody alcohol as well. So, yeah.
So going back to those early days of your working with wine, did you get the opportunity to sort of travel very much and visit wine regions and producers, or had you had much experience before that?
Yeah, kind of had a little bit of experience when I was touring with bands, just like flitting into different regions. But like I said, I wasn't really interested in wine at that stage when I was touring. It sort of came further on. But I started once you get sucked into it, you sort of start traveling around a bit. Obviously, visiting regions around Australia and New Zealand was the first big port of call, I guess. I ended up working at this wine store for quite a few years. Then I moved to a wine store called Kemany's in Bondi. Was on sort of the floor there for a while, and then ended up in the marketing team. But then I bailed out of there and moved to Flinders in Mornington and started working worked for a few years at Gallant with Kevin and Kathleen Quealy, and it was fantastic down there. I just sort of started studying at Charles Sturt. What didn't really get deeply into any overseas trips until I started working. I came back from Mornington after working down there for about 2 years, and then I started flitting over to Europe and farming around in wine regions over there and having a look around. Gets to a point, I'm at a point now where I've been to so many wineries that I don't really want to visit wineries anymore. I just want to kick stuff around in vineyards and climb up hills and look around. But done, the last sort of, I guess, last sort of 6 to 8 years have been pretty extensive, trips every year around the place. So, that's one of the great things is getting out there and seeing, and meeting the people that actually make the wines. It's a really cool thing.
At what point did you get interested in the particular wines that you really respond with?
Well, I got a bit of a leaning towards, I just hate that natural fucking word, eh? It just drives me nuts. I mean, there's got to be a better word for it, but, I like lo-fi wines. That's probably a good, low for low inputs, low manipulation, natural. I mean, the good thing about the word natural, I guess, is it gets people's backs up, and no change ever comes if people don't ask the questions that make people squirm, so I guess natural's sort of good in that respect. But I sort of got turned onto those, a couple of sort of trips to France, and trying some of the wines in sort of wine bars and stuff like that in Paris. But the main impetus was a friend of mine, Andrew Gard, who's bringing in some wines, and he's probably been a driving force in the acceptance of natural wines into Australia, I guess. He was one of the first guys, first cabs off the rank, pretty much went to the Kermit Lynch catalogue and said, I'll have all of those, and basically brought them over, which isn't a bad thing. I mean, Adventures on the Wine Route is probably one of my favourite books in the world.
Sure.
And he's basically read that book and gone, that producer sounds cool, I'll have that. That producer sounds cool. So he's got a pretty snazzy portfolio, and that sort of got me into those wines. At once I was working at, before I moved to the Barossa in '08, I was working at Langton's as the Sydney auction manager, and decided to jump ship before Woolworths sort of took it over and moved down here. And then the bloody licensing laws changed in Sydney, so all these cool, groovy wine bars bloody opened up, and I missed out on all that first sort of
Sure.
flush of excitement with all those wine bars. So, mind you, I had plenty of trips going back and forth to Sydney, so I got to go and make an absolute mess of myself in Wine Library in 10 William Street and Love Tilly and all those sort of places. But it was just a shame that wasn't there while I was working in Sydney.
It is interesting that with the licensing changes in Sydney and a lot of these small bars opening up, that they really wanted to do something different, and working with these lo-fi wines, or authentic, which still sounds a little bit pretentious.
Yeah, it's another one of those words, isn't it?
Yeah, that was the kind of the path they took, and they really established a strong identity for themselves.
Yeah, for sure. No, I agree with that totally. I mean, I guess it's just it's about that sort of small plates and small glasses, basically, type sort of scenario where you're trying all sorts of different types of food. You're trying all these different exciting wines that you don't normally try, and you wouldn't be buying them at your local boozatorium. They wouldn't be forced back near the checkout.
Yeah.
So you're getting access to all these wines that you normally wouldn't try, and it just opens up this whole sort of a whole new world, and that's what's really exciting. You'd walk into some of these bars, and just the atmosphere in there was just awesome. There's people that are actually experimenting with booze, and I think it's just been a fantastic thing for the wine industry, really. And when you look at that, sort of trickles down as well. All these, of course, we had the strength of the Aussie dollar, and we had all these new sort of small importers coming up, all these really cool and groovy wines coming into the country. That goes straight to the winemakers as well. The winemakers get access to these wines. They start trying these wines. They start experimenting.
Yeah.
And that drives innovation. And that's why you find, we've got all these young winemakers around that are just making shit hot booze at the moment.
Yeah.
And that's just a really exciting thing for the industry. I mean, we've got classic stalwart brands and cracking wines. There's more contemporary producers as well, but we've got this undercurrent bubbling away of just these guys that are innovating and experimenting, and that's really exciting.
Now, when did you sort of start thinking about communication in terms of writing or talking, that kind of thing?
I sort of always I was pretty shitty at English at school. You could probably tell that from reading my blog. But anyway, I used to noodle around on some wine forums, like Australian and overseas wine forums, like being a total wine geek. And I started probably one of the early wine blogs, I reckon, in Australia, called Vinocence. That was years ago, probably, I don't know, probably about 13 years ago.
Yeah.
So that was one of the first blogs around, and just started noodling around on that. And I think I just got contacted by an editor for a magazine and who'd been reading my blog, because by that stage writing about wines on online was kind of a new phenomenon, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And asked me to do some work for a magazine. Always, I've still been interested in online communication as well, because I like the freedom of it.
Sure.
And it just seems like a better medium for me, and it's like it's not so regimented and strict in its format. You can pretty much freestyle. So I kind of like that aspect. And then just kept on doing it. I guess I've been writing for magazines since about sort of 2008, I guess. But yeah, it's just a nice outlet to be able to communicate, and it's nice to get feedback from people as well, and to to actually look at your analytics and go, shit, people are reading what I'm saying, you know.
Mm.
We don't really get much feedback from magazines. You just like put an article in and it goes out, and you know it goes out, but you actually get sort of you got a feedback loop with anything you put up on the web.
Yeah. When you started the Vinofreakism blog,
Mm.
was the idea about sort of focusing in on these lo-fi wines that you were interested in, and trying to sort of communicate a little bit more and introduce these possibly harder to find wines to an audience?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the idea was to drill down a bit and find a niche. And you know, if you're doing any sort of communication, I guess you get become more authoritative if you drill down into something. And it just that was something that I was, you know, there were wines that I was drinking at the time, and they were really exciting me. And I hope that comes across in the way that I write about them. You know, it's there's a lot of joy in those wines. The thing is, it's not a, you know, it's not supposed to be a platform where I'm critiquing wines. I'm only writing about wines that I've really enjoyed.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not burping out a 60 word tasting note and a magic score out of 100 or something. And you know, like so many, you know, commentators, online commentators, I'm trying to give a backstory and some context as well.
Yeah.
And trying to tie it in with some weird imagery and just make it a bit fun. Eh? Just like wine throws up shitloads of barriers. You know, it's seen as being really stuffy and poncy, and you've just got to try and break down barriers
Yeah.
and make people. I mean, the sole purpose of a wine communicator is to make people love wine a bit more. And if you can't do that, you're losing. Eh? You're not doing your job.
Mm. Mm.
And that's just really important. So you just got to break down some barriers and just try and express the joy of wine on a page, and hopefully people will sort of read your words and get inspired to buy a bottle.
Well, the thing that I admire about really good wine communicators is that they're also encouraging people to kind of seek out more for themselves and to try different things and really try and hone in on what they like and perhaps why they like it. Trying to understand what are the elements of that wine, or what are the like a number of wines. What do they have in common that might be possibly why they respond more to those kind of wines, rather than just sort of, I'm the expert, and just trust me, this is good, this is not, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just taking people on a journey. You know, it's just quite often if you're going on a journey, you need that first push to take the first step. You know,
Sure.
it's just good. You just got to take people somewhere. And I mean, one thing that I wasn't doing in my blog, and I probably should have done, was making recommendations. If you like this Jurançon, you might like this, or you might like that. You know, and give people other options, and then they can trot off merrily on their journey and take different forks. But you know, that's just something I can build into it, I guess.
And at the same
Um,
time, if they respond positively to something you review, like as you were saying before, you have that immediacy of the feedback where people can say, "Oh, thanks, Dave. I had to try this, and I really loved it. Can you recommend some other stuff?"
yeah, no, that's right. I mean, you've got that facility where you've got that open line of feedback and communication with anybody that's reading your blog, and that's a really powerful thing. So that's really cool. Whereas traditional media is a closed loop. Basically, you haven't got that feedback. Whereas many online media, you've got that option, which is very cool thing.
Mm. And when you made that shift down to the Barossa Valley,
Mm.
what sort of led you to that part of Australia, and what did you sort of start doing whilst you were there?
I did vintage here a couple of times while I was working in retail in Sydney. So I sort of knew quite a few people here. And we just, had the suits were marching through Langton's doing due diligence, and I was just going, I'm not going to handle this. I don't work very well under hierarchical structures, and I knew I'd just like lose my shit.
Mm.
So just decided to draw up a short list of places to go, and made a list up of wine regions, and just decided to Barossa. I knew quite a few people here, and it just seemed appealing. So ended up I was having didn't even line up a job or anything. But I was just having going away drinks at a pub in Sydney. And while I was having these drinks, Kim Toysner rang me up and went, "I'll give you a bloody job." So that was sweet. So I moved there. I ended up pruning for about 5 or 6 weeks, and then started working the winery with Kim, and was with Kim and Mick for probably 3.5 years. Just doing some marketing and brand manager for them, and it's kind of a pretty varied job because you'd be in the winery over vintage and doing the marketing stuff, and also whipping down to Adelaide and doing sales, which I find soul destroying. By the way, I'm not a salesman by any stretch of the imagination. And yeah, so it was interesting. And then I left Toysner a few years back now, and just decided to do my own thing. So just do split my time between sort of a bit of wine writing for magazines and a bit of marketing for a couple of wineries as well. So yeah.
When you're writing for magazines, there's a sort of a different approach. Do they generally kind of give you something that they want you to write about, or do you kind of pitch them different ideas?
A bit of both. They'll certainly come to you with things that they need covered and ask you to be interested in covering it. So there's that, but yeah, generally pitch stories to them.
Okay.
So now's the sort of, last month and yeah, this is probably the best time to pitch stories to magazines. You get an idea of what you've got coming up in the next year and where you might be going and things that might be happening. So yeah, that's probably the time you do it. But yeah, generally I pitch stories and they get yayed or nayed by the powers that be.
Right. And is that sort of where you tend to do a bit more of your traveling these days?
Still travel fairly extensively. Like I've been hitting the wine show circuit pretty heavily the last sort of 3 years.
Okay.
And generally I tie in visits to wine shows that I'm doing. So if I'm doing the Royal Melbourne show, I'll spend 3 or 4 days in the Yarra Valley afterwards, or Mornington or something. So I generally try and tack on little bits and pieces in regions to wine show visits, and yeah, Europe as well. Sort of just basically around what's interesting me at the time. I've got a trip to Europe coming up in May, and I'm just piecing together where I'm going to be going and what I'm going to be visiting. So mainly stories just sort of gravitate out of those sort of regions that I'll be visiting at the time.
How did you get involved with wine show judging?
Oh, I kind of done a couple before. Being an associate at the Boutique Wine Awards in Sydney like years ago, probably 2007ish, 2008.
Oh, okay.
And then came to the Barossa and I was an associate here in '09 and got involved in tiny little wine show called the Marananga Wine Show, which is like all the wines from the west of the Poa River in the Barossa. So it's all the western sort of sub-regions.
Yeah.
So I did a few of those. Then got accepted into the Len Evans tutorial in 2011 after 6 attempts of writing in and pleading my case. They finally took pity on me and let me in. And
you did okay though.
Yeah, I did. I managed to. It was my sort of Stephen Bradbury moment, I reckon. Everyone fell over at the last hurdle, and I just like floated through. I think there was pretty much 6 of us like in the running on the final morning for the DRC tasting, and luckily I got quite a few of them right in the tasting, and I just managed to pit people at the post. But I don't know how I did it. We had this. When you go to the Len Evans tutorial, you get given an envelope and it's got your sponsor and your room key in it. And I managed to get the chairman's suite, which is Len Evans' old suite, and it's this massive room. So that was a designated party room.
Wow. Okay.
So I was just getting on the last night. We had this party with and we were making all these Negronis and managed to kick Andrew Thomas out of my room at like 5 o'clock in the morning or something stupid.
Wow.
And then got to
it's amazing that you managed to kick him out before the sun came up.
That's true. Yeah, Tomo is a stayer. And then, I got an hour's sleep and stepped out of the bed the next morning and stood on like an orange peel from a Negroni and just like fell flat on my ass. And then sat there for maybe an hour and a half, just doing précis of tasting notes on past DRC tastings from magazines and websites, and just writing down what I should be finding in each of these wines, and with a shocking hangover,
Mm.
and then just managed to go in there and do really well. So it was pretty lucky in the end, but yeah, it was a good result. And I ended up getting ducks in the end, which was awesome. So that sort of propelled me into the wine show circuit in Australia, and pretty much been doing sort of 9 or 10 shows a year since then, which is a lot.
That's a pretty grueling schedule.
Yeah, it is. It's like sort of 2.5 months away from home, and especially for a poor, impoverished wine hack, having 2.5 months away from home, not earning any money, is pretty hard going. But
Not to mention the toll it's going to take tasting, hundreds of wines.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's getting a lot better. Obviously, they're bringing the number of wines that you taste in a day down. So lots of shows you're judging between sort of 110 to 130 wines a day, which is totally doable. Like sort of, you don't get too fatigued with that much. But some shows are still up around the sort of 180 wine mark, which is just ridiculous. So
Yep.
yeah, but it's been great. I mean, it's been a great experience. You really um, what you do learn your strengths and your weaknesses when you're judging. I mean, there's certain varieties that you're very good at judging, and there's other things that you bloody hope, or you're not hopeless, but you're not as good at.
Yep.
You learn your strong suits. It's been great for seeing just like a spectrum of Australian wines. I mean, you look at done the James Halliday Chardonnay Challenge attached to the Yarra Valley Wine Show for the last 3 years, and
Yeah.
to see 700 Chardonnays in one spot is pretty amazing.
Mm, mm.
Um, but yeah, it's been a fantastic experience. Probably, I don't think I'll be doing 10 next year. Got to start sort of winding it back, but yeah, you can't sort of keep up that pace for too long, I reckon. But yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of the wine show system costs, gets a bit of flack from especially on social media. Um, but I think it's a very worthwhile exercise still.
Well, it's interesting. I had a chat about it recently, and sort of talking about ways that I guess wine shows can be best utilized to communicate and educate the consumer, because ultimately
Hmm.
that's who it should be for, and ways that it can kind of stay relevant, I guess. Um, and I know that like what we talked about was how that they are doing that, and I think what like how you've been like judging at shows for a while now, so I'm assuming you've adjusted to, for example, the 100 point system that they've now
Yeah.
adopted across the board with the wine shows. Was that a difficult or a fairly straightforward adjustment?
Oh, look, it's a fairly straightforward adjustment. I think some people struggled more than others. When I first started my first wine blog, I was scoring wines out of 100, so I was sort of used to doing it, I guess. Then the last sort of, oh, yeah, quite a few years, I haven't bothered scoring wines because it just, in retrospect, it seems a pretty silly thing to bloody do. I know it's sort of expected now, in some respects, but I think it's just a, a silly thing, really, scoring wise. It wasn't hard to. I'd probably much prefer to score wines out of 20. There's less bandwidth, less sort of personal interpretation. You're cutting out a few variables
Yep.
in scoring. I mean, I think the main thing for adopting 100 points in wine shows was to communicate to the punters. But now there's such compression in wine scores. You can see like score creep through all the big commentators in Australian wines, where you just it's hardly a wine that comes out that isn't below 92 or 93 or something like that now.
Mm.
Um, and 97s and 98s are the bloody norm. And it just seems ridiculous to me that it's got to that point. And half of that is, you know, there's the whole sort of game of, giving wines high scores and getting, just to stay in business. Basically, the wineries will keep sending you on junkets and keep sending you samples, and you'll get more gigs because you're scoring things higher. So it's just a dodgy, this dodgy sort of circle. But when you consider, there were some results in wine shows last year where it just demeans the scoring scale as well. Like, not one to pick on any show, but there was the Queensland wine show where a Lindeman's Pinot Gris got up, and in the communications, it was given like 96 points. And realistically, a sort of $10 bottle of wine at 96 points possible, but it's probably not a fair thing.
Yeah, I think one of the recent ones for me that kind of stuck out was, and it actually then generated a bit of coverage in the mainstream media, was a number of Aldi, branded
Oh, yeah.
wines, sort of, really doing well at I think it was the National Wine Show, and it's just sort of, it just leads to, unfortunately, irresponsible reporting where they don't put things in context, because it's probably not, it's not easy to put that kind of thing in context in the mainstream media, sort of a short form article. You'd have to go to, reasonable lengths to actually justify it, and that
For
kind of
sure.
thing. And so it's just sort of, it leads to misrepresentation where, the average consumer is sort of saying, well, there you go. It just goes to show you that I don't need to spend money to get so-called good wines. I need to spend $5 or $10 at Aldi, and I can get just as good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's sort of, I think it's confusing, the issue using the 100-point scale more than anything else. But there's been a disconnect between wine shows and the consumer for a while now.
Yeah.
And that's trying to be, we're trying to rectify it. Bringing, I mean, the McLaren Vale show did a great thing this year about, bringing food into the equation as well. I know the Sydney International wine show's done that for quite a few years, but that's more of a private sort of show. It's not sort of one of the, not on the national show circuit, I guess.
Yeah.
So to have a regional show driving that innovation is a great thing as well, and also having the elders of the Australian wine industry. Not that I should call Ian Riggs an elder because he'll kill me, but having Riggsy and Brian Walsh and Hewan and James Halliday there, judging certain classes and holding masterclasses and dinners while the show was on was a great thing. And I think, you've got to draw the public in as well. I personally like to see a consumer panel on shows as well,
Okay.
because, it's pretty meaningless unless, if you're trying to get results out to a consumer, if you haven't got consumers judging the wine, I can't see. Obviously there's credibility because it's experience from a judging panel, but it'd be nice to have some consumer input as well.
Yeah.
And it could be done. It'd be a great way to connect for wineries as well, and to get social proof would be to every winery that enters a wine show gets a golden ticket, like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, and they get a golden ticket, and that gets put out to their mailing list, and it's like, buy a case of wine and get an entry to be a judge at the yada yada wine show.
Yeah.
So you're getting buy-in from the consumers from that point of view, and then when all the tickets are in, you just draw a panel of 6 consumers to judge at the Sydney show and give them a GoPro and let them rip, So I think that's probably a good thing to do as well. And classes have got to change as well. I mean, we do judge everything varietally at the moment, but they've got to be more sort of price sensitive, because consumers buy on price more than anything else.
Of course.
So we should be talking about, trophies for the best sub $15 wine and stuff like that. Some things that resonate with consumers. But there's heaps of things that can be done. But it's not going to happen in a hurry. And there's a lot of whining about the inconsistency of results as well. But you judge those same wines the next day, and you're going to get different results. It's just a snapshot in time. It's not meant to be, this sort of super accurate, sort of score or trophy for a wine. It's just a moment of time, basically, and you've got to take it as a moment of time. And, it was averaged out over a number of judges, and it came back to a trophy tasting and it got up. So, it's certainly not a finite science, but, it's a thing.
But in terms of other ways that you're, I suppose, working with, the general education communication of consumers, recently you've been traveling around and doing stuff, promoting the Barossa, for example, and getting involved with promoting New Zealand wine as a Kiwi yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
How have you found sort of responses with those kind of programs?
Yeah, great. Doing the Barossa Masterclasses for the Good Food and Wine shows was fantastic. It was, vast majority of them were sold out, which is really pleasing, and quite receptive, audiences as well. Like really keen to learn. Obviously, if you're paying money to go to a masterclass, you're going to be receptive, I guess. But lots of questions, and same with the New Zealand stuff as well. But the trade tastings that I just recently did I was over judging at the New Zealand Wine Awards in Auckland. And I was just showing the trophy wines from that in Melbourne and Brisbane, and that was fantastic. The trade were great. Lots of questions, just good fun. It's just good getting out there and talking about wine and making it interactive as well. There's nothing worse than sort of being a talking head and just and especially with trade, you can't tell the trade to suck eggs. You want their feedback on the wines as well.
Of course.
Everyone's professional, everyone's good at what they do, and you can't think yourself better than anybody else. Because you're constantly learning as well. So it's great to take on feedback and get other people's points of view. That's the great thing about any communication. But yeah, it was great fun. Loved it.
And are you still involved with music at all? Do you get to see much live music, or you still in touch with any of the bands, for example?
Yeah, no, I see some dudes from some bands quite often. But music-wise, no, just plot away on my guitar. I live out in banjo country, so we're on a property in the Eden Valley, which is about sort of 1,800 acres. So we're in the middle of nowhere, so you don't get too many bands coming past here. So sit on the porch and play guitar. That's pretty much it to the ducks and sheep. But
Deliverance style.
Yeah, Deliverance style, absolutely. Banjo country. But yeah, sort of get to catch up with a few guys from bands. There's a few dudes that are into their wine. So the Hoodoo Gurus came through last year and sort of dragged them around a few wineries for a couple of days, which is great fun.
Day in the Green, do they do that in the Barossa Valley?
Yeah, they do. Yeah, they just keep on
through. Or is he
they keep on dragging out all these old dinosaurs that obviously haven't got enough money, and they're just like going through the motions to try and pay their mortgages.
Hey, so I'm taking my dad out to see dance this weekend, so just watch it.
Sorry, bro. Yeah, it'd be nice to see some more sort of, I don't know, cutting edge sort of stuff. Get out and hear in banjo country, but it doesn't really happen. It's generally sort of older, established acts that are sort of just going through the motions now, I guess. I don't want to be too cruel.
It's almost like a chicken egg situation, I guess, because I would think that wine regions and wine businesses would want to engage with a younger audience, but it's a big risk, kind of inviting a sort of a slightly more modern, I guess, or relevant, dare I say it, act out, not knowing if you're going to be able to sell enough tickets to make it worthwhile.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the only way for it to happen would be the promoter to pre-sell stuff and get acts out. I mean, so I've sort of would love to do some stuff. There's a couple of nice venues in the Barossa where you could do pretty cool things and get some cool acts through. But I've got enough on my bloody plate. I don't want to be a promoter.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining me today, Dave. What's the best way people can follow you and keep track of all the fun things you're doing?
Yeah, my blog's at vinofreakism.com. I'm sort of Vino_freakism on Twitter and at Vinofreakism on Instagram. I'm always blathering on about something. So, yeah, say good day.
Yeah, but I'm sure there's going to be plenty of events in a new year that you'll be getting along to, and I look forward to catching up with you myself. But thanks again.
No worries, man. Good to speak to you.
Thank you very much, guys, for tuning into the Vincast for another episode. Thank you also to Dave for joining me this week. As always, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at IntrepidWino, and also on Facebook, facebook.com/IntrepidWino. Please do come and visit me on intrepidwino.com, where you can download and listen to all of the previous episodes of the Vincast. But I do highly recommend jumping onto iTunes or to Stitcher and subscribing to the podcast so you can get the episodes as they go up. Whilst you're there, please do rate and review. It really does help me out a lot, and I look forward to receiving some feedback. But until next time, bye.